This is Chapter 8, Race and Ethnicity, Part 1. So I leave this topic to the end of the semester, more or less because it is still a very heated and controversial topic. I think right now, in terms of what's going on in the United States, especially with what's going on with the case of Ahmaud Arbery, who was a black man who was murdered by two white men while he was out jogging, is in the forefront of everyone's mind. It is very interesting then to see kind of the exchanges between different people in terms of looking at this case. So I'm going to return to it after I give you guys some foundational information, and I am really sad that we are missing out on this discussion in class. So I am going to start out then with the mainstream assumptions about race. That is, if you talk to most people in the mainstream, I think most people actually assume that race is a biological reality. Okay, that is, they assume that there are definitive official racial categories, that everybody fits into one of these categories, and that these categories can be substantiated through physiological factors that are transmitted through biology. Okay, that quite often I really do think, because of these forensic shows and these DNA kit tests, people just think, okay, well, here are these different categories, here are the qualifications to meet those categories, and that everyone fits in one or the other. That when it comes to the reality about race, what we know then is that it is actually not a biological reality. Okay, so I give you the definition on slide 3, that race consists of socially constructed categories of people who share physiological traits that a culture deems important. So, of course, there is this idea of biology, because your physiology then does come from genetics. It does come then from who you are born to. However, what happens is that every field of science, that biology, anthropology, this sociology, psychology, all of them kind of recognize, and there is consensus that there is no genetic or scientific basis for the categories of race. That this was attempted with the Human Genome Project, where they tried to map out all the DNA in the world, and it was quickly then aborted because it was not a feasible thing. They couldn't do it, right? So they are in consensus there is no genetic or scientific basis for our categories of race. So for a lot of you guys are, well, what are they doing then when, in these forensic shows they can actually identify the race based on skulls or bones, or when people take then one of these ancestry kits? Well, what happens in those cases is, first of all, the ancestry kits can only identify an approximate region in which your ancestors originated. But what happens, and this is how we kind of refute this, and you guys can go Google it and see that it is substantiated by geneticists. I'm obviously not a geneticist, so I'm going to give you kind of the short summary version. Is the companies that do these kits do not actually provide a thorough explanation of what the results are based on. And in many cases, there are multiple cases where twins, their genetic material was submitted and they come out different. There are people who have submitted their genetic material multiple times to the same company under different names and gotten different results. That it's not consistent, that we really like to think that we can, spit in a tube and then finally find out all about our DNA. One of the problems is genetics are so complicated that we have no comprehensive genetic database. That is, we only have the data that is already collected. You can't actually get thorough DNA because you'd have to catalog a lot more people. And the main thing that they found is there are no global racial categories. Okay, so yes, race is based on biology simply because we identify it by physiological factors, but it isn't something scientific. It isn't something that we can actually say these are the races, etc. So, what do we use when we are looking at this idea of race? Now, if you see in that definition, I say the physiological traits that a culture deems important. In everyday life, when you're walking around and talking to people, you are conscious of their race. You have no way of accessing their blood, their DNA, their genetic code, any of that. What do we rely on? Well, we actually rely on how someone looks. So you go back to middle school life science and flashback to the word phenotype. So this idea of phenotype is, well, what genes then are physically displayed on your body? What can you see, right? And that is what we actually use to identify race in our everyday lives. Now, I told you guys that this is just how your brain works. You're bombarded with all this information, all this information on a daily basis. And so what happens is we take a quick look at people and instantly sort them into these different categories. I am not saying that people are being judged. I am saying that we sort them with our brains. And throughout the semester, I told you, we instantly go, are they young or old, right? Are they male or female? And then we actually categorize them by race. Now, in class, I usually do an exercise where we kind of talk about the different phenotypes that are used to determine race. I'm going to go over them with you right now. It is more interesting when we do it together as a class. But the first one that comes up has to do with skin tone, right? It is kind of the very easiest way that Americans differentiate race is through people's skin tones. And jumping a little bit ahead of things is in America, race is a foundational issue. That is, when people say, well, why is everything about race? It's because everything is about race. That American slavery was actually founded on this premise that you could easily identify then who was a black person and who was a white person. That we actually, as a nation, used race to subjugate an entire category of people. So we use skin tone as one of the primary ways to kind of quickly code people into race. Another one then, which has become a big deal over time, is hair color and texture, right? That when it comes to hair texture, we actually see a lot right now in the news about what is appropriate. There's legislation now that basically allows black people to wear their hair in the way that it grows out of their heads, right? Which shouldn't be a thing. So hair color and texture, and one thing that is always recognized then are the different facial features that we use in determining race. Now, one of the things that we always look to then are people's eyes, right? The eye shape and eye color, that especially for people who are Asian, then we are kind of identified by having this epicanthal fold in their eyes. And going back to this ancestry DNA thing, we actually think of it as an East Asian trait, right? And if you look at the continent of Asia, you say, well, it's not the case for South Asians, right? Or from people from parts of Asia like Azerbaijan, right? However, when you look at this idea of the epicanthal fold, it's not only located in East Asia. That is, you actually see it among people from South Africa. If you think of Trevor Noah's eyes, his actually look very similar to mine, and within indigenous people kind of all over the world. Eye color then is also kind of subject to what culture you are from. That is, I met a little boy. He was actually a little white boy who came up to me and he asked me, he's like, why are your eyes black? And I said, well, my eyes are actually brown. They're not black. And he said, no, your eyes are black. Why are they black? And it's very interesting because it comes out of the mouth of a kid. And this idea that, well, brown in terms of eye color then is very dependent on what culture that you are from. That is, most Americans then would agree that my hair is fairly black. But if you asked a lot of Asians, they would argue that my hair is actually much lighter than complete black. Okay. That nose shape then is always included in phenotypes used to determine race. That lips then have become kind of a big indicator. We can also look at things like your cheekbones, the shape of your face, right? So Asians tend to have rounder faces. And I put brow ridge in there, and people don't really think about this one. But if you look kind of at people's profiles, then that is also one of those things that we actually attribute to race and to different parts of the world. That is, if you have a very kind of slight brow ridge like mine, then generally then once again East Asian, indigenous, right, even South African. However, if you're looking at a more defined brow ridge, then a lot of times then we kind of see that as white. And then for American Black people, because there is a lot of white heritage, then you kind of see that within that. Now, interestingly enough, ears are not actually racialized, which I always find very fascinating. You will hear someone say, you have, Black people lips, but you don't actually hear someone go, oh, well, you have some really white ears over there, right? Because, I don't know, they're somehow exempt. And the last thing on this list that I put was height and build, that we have actually racialized height, right? We have actually racialized build. Can't even tell you how many times in my life I've been told, you're really big for an Asian girl. Think about it. They actually say it to my face, right? You're really big for an Asian girl. Having the assumption then that if you are Asian, if you're especially East Asian, that you are 5 feet tall and weigh 100 pounds, which obviously is not me. And I put here then what parts of the body are racialized for women. You generally then actually have the racialization of indicators of secondary sex characteristics, right? That we have racialized the butt, we have racialized breasts, we have actually racialized the penis too, which hopefully you don't actually see on people in everyday life while you're walking around in public. But this is how we actually determine race in the United States, is actually we take a quick look at someone and use these phenotypes to sort them into categories. And I will tell you, if people don't know, they will ask, right? I think it's getting a little bit better, but all the time then I was asked, what are you? And it is a very odd question to get in a lot of cases. In my case, they weren't necessarily asking about my race, because I think most people would look at me and identify me as being East Asian. However, what they were talking about is ethnicity. Now, a lot of the mainstream actually sees race and ethnicity as the same thing, right? They also throw in nationality. First of all, your nationality is pretty much where you reside and where you are a citizen. So if someone asked me my nationality, then I would actually say, well, I'm an American because I was born and raised in the United States. In terms of race, I will say then that my race then is Asian, specifically East Asian American. When it comes to ethnicity, then we are looking at a different set of criteria. So whereas race then is based on physiology and your physical body, ethnicity then is actually a social category applied to a group with shared ancestry and cultural heritage. Okay, so rather than physiology, we actually look at the various components of culture when it comes to ethnicity. Primary, and we talked about this when we talked about the components of culture, is the idea of language, right? Because cultures are considered more similar when you share a language, and we can see then that language actually separates cultures in many ways. In addition, we can look at things like religion. We can look at your traditions and customs. We can look at the holidays and celebrations that you engage in. And most basic one, the easiest way to share culture with people is food. Okay. So what I say is that after a few generations in the US, ethnicity tends to blur. It tends to be, it kind of gets a little bit more fuzzy because of intermarriage, because of assimilation, more or less. Okay. First thing to go, language, because it is the hardest to transmit. My parents were immigrants. I was born here. They intentionally did raise me speaking 3 languages while I was growing up. It's interesting though, because my younger brother didn't necessarily learn it the same way I did, because I translated for my brother because he's the younger one. My kids then I could not actually teach, especially Taiwanese, because it is one of those languages that is very much centered around an ethnic group. The official language of Taiwan is actually not Taiwanese, it is Mandarin Chinese. So the first thing lost is usually language. The tradition and customs generally are kind of transmitted most strongly from the first generation, which is the people who actually immigrated to the United States, to the second generation. I was completely dependent on my parents and the Chinese and Taiwanese community in Houston to teach me then the traditions, the customs, etc. The thing that remains after everything is gone is the food, right? So food traditions retain through multiple generations. You may be Italian, right? But it was your great-great-grandparents who came over here. And what happens in that case is that you probably do not speak Italian after all those generations, but you probably do know how to cook Italian food, right? So that is race and ethnicity in a nutshell. I will stop here and then move on to, well then, how do we treat race in the United States in the next part?